talked in this class a lot about energy transitions. We have talked a lot about where we consume energy. Transportation being about a third, electricity being about a third, and about a third of the energy we use in this country is in our buildings, heating and cooling, very broadly speaking. Very broadly speaking. And so tonight we're going to kind of zone in on, not just on how we think about buildings that might be different, but also how we think about places that are places we want to be, that are beautiful, that are attractive, that we want to be in. And I know a lot of you guys are interested in this and the design issues, so come chat with Rolf afterwards. We're going to do some class exercises related to this after this, and then a couple of us are going to go out to dinner with Rolf right afterwards. So Rolf has thought a lot about these issues from many perspectives. He can tell you all about that, and he, for many years, was involved with the largest architectural firm here in Vermont.
Still
is involved. Still is involved, and which does all kinds of interesting things, and he can tell you all about that. So, big energy action seminar. Welcome to Rolf Keilman. I can move your slides, Rolf, or you can go back and forth however you want to do.
Is there a little thing, or you got to do that?
So if you like, I can stand here.
That seems wasteful.
I'll let you do it.
Okay. So just this guy right here? One of these? Yeah.
This one.
Okay. All right. Good. And you can hear me okay, you guys? The room is acoustically useful. So I'm not quite following the recipe that Richard alluded to. You could say that I don't necessarily give what you might categorize as how-to talks. In other words, the methodology behind making good buildings, making good towns. I can't say to you that, gee, I have a really intimate and familiar knowledge of how that all works. I'm still figuring it out for myself. And so as much as anything, I think it's interesting, or I hope it's interesting, for you to hear some of the things that I tend to observe, think about, try to act on, sort of accumulated knowledge over time. It's worth saying also that especially architecture is a craft, and I very much think it's a craft, a blend of art and science. And I should say to you also that my strength is more in the former rather than the latter, i.e. art. I come from an art background, but it does teach you how to see, how to observe how things appear to be working, especially the dynamics in our communities, the physical dynamics in our communities. So you'll have to bear with me. There may be some technical questions that you have that I wouldn't have the vaguest how to answer. The only thing I could say for myself is that I've been either smart enough or maybe wise enough to understand where my own voids are and to sort of get others to fill those in. And that's been reasonably successful. But there are certainly people, especially in the state of Vermont, which is very much a hotbed of knowledgeable people who are making buildings, especially energy efficient, healthy, resourceful buildings. So there's a myriad of people here who I think are really good specifically on that topic. So this is a little bit of just personal stuff, because I think that in large measure it's understanding the broader dynamics of how we live and how that influences the kinds of buildings we choose to inhabit and how we make those buildings. Because it must be clear to all of you that you could do one of the most resourceful, energy efficient, even elegant, beautiful buildings and park it in some place where you're constantly having to access carbon-burning vehicles. The infrastructure to support you in that hinterland location that you've chosen for yourself is not necessarily always the wisest choice. So it's interesting to sort of observe how people over time, over history, have sort of gathered themselves together in communities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about towns and making good towns and what seems to be the way in which we kind of coalesce ourselves. I'm going to talk a little bit about what composes, what are the essential parts of those communities. And when ingredients are missing, I think those communities don't function as well for us. I'm going to talk a little bit, this is more Richard's area of expertise, how we move around and observations about how we move around. I'm also sort of a fierce adherent. My brother's an engineer. And a lot of those people that I was talking to you about before who support me in my endeavors, when it comes to the science of things, they're scientists for a reason. I think self-expression, when you are involved in the sciences, automatically seems to get complicated. And I strive to keep things as simple, as pure, and as elegant as possible. So I tend to look at natural systems, the simple act of opening a window, how one organizes a building on a site. If it's cold, especially in a climate like ours, one tends to. I had a wonderful architecture professor when I was in school, and he used to talk, it sounds somewhat elitist, but he used to talk about the served and the servant spaces. It had nothing to do with servitude. It had more to do with those spaces that are sort of supportive places and those spaces where we spend most of our time. Stated simply, one might consider a pantry or a half bath in the back of your house a servant kind of space, whereas the living room or the kitchen or where we might eat, those are the spaces that are served. And one tends to organize those spaces, especially in a climate like ours, such that the served spaces, they have access to the light. They have access to ventilation. Not that the others don't, but they are our primary places where we live and where we ourselves, are nourished in some way. So it's a very simple, you go to a piece of land or a lot in a city and you try to organize the internal components of whatever structure you're making. And I think by observing sort of natural systems, how the sun moves, where the wind's coming from, what the declination of the sun is during the course of the seasons, those things teach you a lot. And I've had the good fortune to travel around a lot and to see some of the contrasting systems that work in other kinds of climates and other sort of economic zones. It's a very interesting thing. It makes you much more acutely aware of just what we have around us and how we can simplify and make that immediate setting more resource efficient for ourselves and our use. So I don't know if that all makes sense to you necessarily, but I had some things written down, but now I've just blabbed. That 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 ratio, I remember talking about that in the mid-90s. I wonder if that statistic still holds true. I tend to think that in Vermont, at least, which is, despite the fact that it's a small state, it's somewhat transportation intensive. I think we, maybe not right at the moment, but we tend to favor that transport process a little bit. And manufacturing is definitely something, Richard described it as electrical consumption. I've always heard it, that the making of things constitutes that 1/3. And I was always told that this was non-renewable resources is what we were talking about, the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Transport, making of things, and inhabiting our buildings. And of course, inhabiting our buildings, that's a big factor. And even though, as I said to you, I claim to be more on the art side of things, you have a very, very deep responsibility to make sure that the buildings that we make are as good as they can possibly be. Not just, hey, that they're beautiful, that they're useful, but that they are, supremely resource efficient. And it's no longer, I'll finish up with this a little bit, but I'll stress it again now. It's no longer a process that cannot be readily achieved. You perhaps heard the term during the course of this semester, net zero buildings, basically buildings that are, from an energy standpoint, neutral, or perhaps produce even more than what they consume. And that is no longer a difficult proposition. Much as we clad ourselves on a common sense level in highly sophisticated parkas in the wintertime, the envelopes that basically encircle our buildings have been remarkably primitive over the last 100 years. And it's really the last 20 years where we've really started to progress again on that front and really make, I think, giant strides in just the envelope and the making of the envelope, and then dealing with the resultant climatic consequences inside our buildings. So net zero, or a future that basically has our buildings producing more energy than they utilize, is not a difficult thing to achieve. Even in our older buildings, it involves more effort, but it's certainly something that's achievable. So when people talk to you about the difficulties of these processes, they are no longer difficult, and there is really no excuse, although I've needed a few in my past, for not doing that. So this is Joey's perfect house. I always liked the affinity. This was a young student of mine, maybe 30 years ago. And I like the automatic sort of organic bent that Joey's perfect house took. Oh yeah, I'm the one that works this. Good towns. Let me talk about that a little bit. And when I say good towns, I really mean good cities, good villages, communities of almost any size. A small hamlet in a Norwegian agricultural countryside. I'm really talking about those places where we gather together. And we tend to do that with regularity. This is a small town in northern Morocco. You've probably seen many of these images before. This is Machu Picchu. I always love looking at the uniformity of these places. Clearly, the rationale was, these are the materials available to us, and these are the materials we're going to utilize to make our buildings and our towns. This is Delgado province in the northern portion of Mozambique. It's a human inclination to gather together. This is people playing, doing the laundry. It's a hot climate. But we want to be with other human beings. Not all of us, but the majority of us. And for the most part in our history, we've done this with remarkable common sense and intelligence. I mean, you look at historic Vermont, New England communities. I spent quite a bit of time in portions of Switzerland, topographically and climatically challenged, much like we are here. But if you look at the concentration of settlement, this is the small village of Vals. It's maybe 350 people. They value the hinterland. It's really clear. It's much more topographically challenged than this image tends to show. But if you see the clustering, the almost pell-mell clustering of town buildings and residences in Vals, and then look at the surrounding landscape, it's almost as if there was an unwritten law that the village was encircled by some person's belt, and you did not step out of that region. You valued the land so much for a variety of different purposes and enjoyed living with other people. And the result was these concentrated villages, and of course, we see much of that, in our immediate geographical area. This is the Rideau Canal, frozen in winter. Even in harsher climates, this compulsion to gather together and seems to rule the day. This is Ottawa, Canada. If you ever want some real fun, go up to the Winterlude. It's 3 weeks in February, a kind of winter festival, and skate on the canal. You can skate about 13 or 14 miles along this little route. This is probably one of the more intense parts, but that's what I chose to photograph. So, I talked a little bit about the parts of our communities, and some of this is also, again, my personal observations about what are those things that sort of comprise our cities, towns, and villages. And, it's simple enough. Any one of us can make these observations, but, this is the Stratford Meeting House in Stratford, Vermont. I don't think I spelled it quite right. It's one of the most beautiful meeting houses that we have in our state, I think, along with Rockingham and maybe the Richmond Round Church. Some of these serve ecclesiastical purposes. Some were just the centers of our community where we met indoors and functioned with our fellow citizens. And we've utilized these meeting houses and churches, and it's a phenomenon throughout the world. This is Graubünden, again, in Switzerland. This is a very famous architect, actually, who works in that area. I went to see a small chapel that he had done, parked almost in the middle of on the edge of an agricultural meadow. And you're perhaps familiar with some of the Stave churches of Norway. These are some of the most beautiful buildings, most beautifully scaled buildings that I've seen in my lifetime. Most of these are 1,000 years old or more. We've lost several, obviously, but and then what we often refer to as the sort of the essence of the outdoor living room. It's not just indoors that we gather; we also gather outside, and we have a wonderful tradition and history of that here in New England. The kind of common outdoor spaces, they used to be somewhat agriculturally purposed initially, and that use has changed a little bit over time, but it's still a place where we gather. The Church Street Marketplace, is a similar. Most of the slides I'm showing you, I've either been to or had a hand in some way. So it's a little bit of a mix. That's not intended for self-promotion. It's just intended to give you some kind of look at what I look at. And so the focus on the pedestrian, obviously, that was a major. When I first came to Burlington, the firm I worked for was in the process of designing or converting Church Street, which was then a vehicle-laden street of commerce, to a place where you could walk easily in safety and still function from a commercial standpoint. We have a wonderful tradition. I mean, it's become somewhat distorted over time, but the sort of places of indoor commerce, shops, and mildly controlled climates. Most of these places, this is a small galleria in Paris that ventilates naturally out through the top just by. They have a big crank system where they operate these windows so that they may have air conditioned it over time, but I think originally it worked very well. And then more structured kinds of places, some of you may have traveled a little bit, but we have this grand tradition of, the vast public square where we gather now, restaurants, cafes, all sorts of activities. There's some shots that I saw of this place with a flower market in the middle of it. And as I said, we have this phenomenon here ourselves, insofar as the kind of public living room. Chelsea, Vermont happens to be a space or a town that has two of these greens side by side. As I've heard it, one is intended more for kind of public use. They used to be used almost exclusively for agricultural activity, but and one is more sort of state functions. I think the county courthouse, say, for example, and some other functions sit adjacent to this space. So, and of course, an essential ingredient is also sort of places to live. And this is a small apartment building on the waterfront in Burlington. This actually is a highly efficient structure. I didn't actually have anything to do with this, but not only is it wonderfully placed insofar as just the kind of panoramic view you have of the lake, much of this is affordable housing as well. People aren't always enthralled with the color scheme, but it's a very resource-efficient building. More modest places to live. This is a little house in Savannah. This is in the historic city of Delft in the Netherlands, a highly technically accomplished, energy-efficient house with, this is probably one of these houses that technically ran out of control to some degree. A lot of operable louvers and mechanized systems to efficiently control climate, but things tend to go wrong with those systems. This was also the home of a graphic designer and had a space within it to work. But you should have seen how this building was positioned cheek by jowl with a whole cascade of historic residential structures in Delft. It's very much like Amsterdam, a lot of those wonderfully scrolled gable structures all over. But sometimes we get very elaborate in our, this is Falling Water in Bear Run, Pennsylvania by Frank Lloyd Wright. Some say it's the consummate integration of a structure with its natural surroundings. I'm not sure I'd quite agree. It's not exactly resource efficient, but certainly a marvel of its time.
Well, that's obviously a famous Falling Water and that architect was Stave, but would you have to drive to that place? I mean, the transportation wouldn't have been something they would have thought about?
I think you would bike, but most people would drive, yeah. It's near a very small town. It's actually part of a nature conservancy called Bear Run, and it's maybe an hour and a half from Pittsburgh, south and east of Pittsburgh. For architects, we have our sort of little Mecca locations, you know, where we go to worship, and this is one of those places, so. Or its forerunner. You have a very interesting movement in the United States at the moment amongst academic institutions. I don't think the University of Vermont participates in this, but the architecture school at Norwich does. And there's a modest undergraduate program for architecture at Middlebury, and it's called the Solar Decathlon, and I think it's sponsored. I'm not sure who sponsors it, Department of Energy maybe. So every year college students are building prototypical residential structures. They're usually pretty modest in size, you know, somewhere between 700 to 1,000 square feet, but they're incredibly well done. And this is one actually done by the University of Texas Architecture School. Anyway, housing, that's places to work, you know. Another essential ingredient, you know, in most of our, quote, good towns. This is Ben & Jerry's. This is in an old digital computer manufacturing facility in South Burlington, Vermont. Probably most of you don't remember that facility. It's a huge, vast warehouse-type structure that Ben & Jerry's just dropped their, quote, corporate headquarters into. Or Burton Snowboards down on Industrial Avenue. This was a facility where General Electric used to make armaments, and basically now Burton makes their snowboards. They did make snowboards there for a long time. It's mostly an administrative location, and I think they have their retail store there. So. Yes, yeah. I wish this one I had, but I did not. But, So places of learning, culture, entertainment, I mean, also essential ingredients in most of our good towns. This is the Stockholm Public Library. These libraries are changing, but actually one of the most wonderful buildings that I've had a chance to visit. You know, in our own town, the Flynn Theater, which used to be a bit of a relic, but brought back to life over the last 30 years and very much, you know, a central piece in our community here in Burlington. You get some odd ducks. This is in the north of Norway. The same architect, Swiss architect who did that little chapel I showed you earlier, did a memorial much like the one in Salem, Massachusetts. I think this phenomenon went all over the, you know, this is a fishing community, and yet this was a small museum, a memorial to people who had been either tortured or killed in one of these witch trial processes. In our own town, this is also a very resource-efficient building. Its rooftop is completely covered in photovoltaic panels. You know, sits right in the heart of our community on King Street in sort of a very interesting transitional kind of neighborhood, very much a refugee center, if you're familiar with that part of Burlington. And this is an interesting building. I went to visit this just recently, and I'll tell you a little story in a minute about it when I talk a little bit more about the ways in which we move around. The Rijksmuseum, built in the 1870s in Amsterdam. So one process, and I mean, this is a very difficult process. Richard and I both live in the same town. And it's not something we get much training in, I think. You know, it's somehow learning how to make a building. It's difficult, but it's not one that probably most of you could not master. The politics involved in how to make a good town or a community, and the planning process behind the making of those places is a very difficult engagement, I would say, requiring almost full engagement by most members of our community. And yet it's something that's left to a very few number of people who seem to often want to meander in directions that the bulk of us don't support. In the creation of places that really have very little to do with what most of us enjoy and are familiar with and are comfortable with. So this is just sort of a call to arms, I guess, in some measure, that getting involved in the community that you ultimately become a part of, and you already are, and learning how those communities are made, how they've been made historically, and how one replicates some of those patterns, especially the ones that are beneficial to all of us, I think is a very tasking kind of endeavor. So I think I can't stress enough the sort of importance of getting yourself involved in a knowledgeable way about how our communities grow. I mean, you can see Burlington, I don't know how long most of you have been here in school, but there have been some wonderful things that have happened in this community. I would say the development, or perhaps potentially the lack of development of the waterfront, especially since it's been primarily devoted to public use, is really a terrific phenomenon. And the fact that all of us as citizens have access to that waterfront is a terrific thing. The kind of general, I'd call it aversion to density in communities like ours, unfortunately also breeds the kind of, you know, urban sprawl that even in an area like ours we start to see, where access to infrastructure, being able to move around, especially if you're elderly or young, becomes extremely difficult. If you watch the whole process that's happening in the direction that we live, you know, Dorset Street, sort of that general direction, you see vast sort of agricultural meadows being consumed by houses that in large measure have no system of support insofar as like access to a small grocery store. They don't exist out there. They're sort of uniformly zoned. And that planning process is a complex one, requires a lot of patience and fortitude, but one that is worth getting involved with. And we're not the only ones. There have been a variety of different architecture and planning firms involved in the Burlington waterfront, but this is just sort of an early diagram when the bike path really started to become a reality, which was sort of in the mid-'80s. It's interesting to look at these older survey plans. This is Burlington again, and the allocation of plots of land. You can see Lake Champlain there on the left, and a lot of this was laid out by surveyors, and not that they necessarily had a clear understanding of how to make a good town, but they did have a fairly clear understanding of communities. Say, for example, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Savannah, Georgia, or Montreal, or New York. I mean, most of these cities somehow managed to get in their midst very interesting outdoor public spaces. You have Mount Royal in Montreal, Prospect Park in Brooklyn, Central Park in New York. The way in which Savannah is made, which was by a surveyor, insofar as chamfered streets and public spaces at the intersections of streets. You look at Boston and the creation of the Fenway, and mind you, that was a swamp, so not exactly highly susceptible to development early on, but interesting to look back at the history of town making, not just in our country, but also elsewhere.
Rolf, just stay with that, because these guys would know.
Yeah.
You used to have to cross barbed wire to get to the waterfront.
Yeah.
It was a scary industrial place. It was unsafe, with signs that said, no public allowed.
It was strictly the domain of the railroad and the domain of, I don't think there are too many left at this point, but I would say a goodly number was something like about 60 of those large circular oil storage tanks. They used to predominate much of the waterfront in the 20th century. So we're making progress there, I think. This is the town of Barrie, a little more, undulates a little more. And it's not just necessarily, a town, a village, or a city, or a part of one of those. There are also institutions. This is a small school in Vermont called Vermont Law School in South Royalton. Again, much of what we're striving for here was to really push the automobile out of the actual campus domain to the perimeter and really create a much stronger sense of connection between buildings and also, pedestrian access between buildings so that you weren't traversing parking lots to get to your destination. And also reinforcing South Royalton itself, which was a very compact, historic village. We were doing a lot of infill in places like this. This, say, for example, was the new main library. And there was great discussion about putting it sort of on the perimeter in some fashion. And instead, we just sort of really, in a very purposeful way, kept it in the central portion of the campus and also used it to sort of shape certain outdoor spaces that we knew would be very useful. So you guys, after a semester of this, you probably know a whole lot more about this than I would. But how we move about, I'll just tell you a couple of little anecdotes that one of those little Swiss villages I showed you, the one that has about 300 people living in it, we went to visit an architect there that we really admired. And we were in a small guest house, a friend and I, and we noticed that probably about every hour, a civic bus, much like the one on the left there, that yellow one, was coming to the village. And we thought, for heaven's sake, I mean, there are only 200, 250 people in this community. What are these buses doing here every hour, more or less? And we started to ask a little bit. And then we started to notice that the bus had racks on the top. It had a little postal mark on it. It had a little school bus sign on it. They were using that one bus system to basically function as UPS, FedEx, the postal system, the school bus, regular transportation for the elderly to other communities surrounding this particular one, there was a fabulous mill shop in this town that produced doors and windows and cabinetry of incredible sophistication. They used the roof of this bus to transport their materials to other outlying towns for whom they'd contracted with to make some of those components. So it was basically one element of transportation that was functioning in about 6, 7, 8 directions. And that, in turn, enabled the kind of frequency that we were observing in that particular community. Instead, I have FedEx driving up my sister-in-law's driveway. They never come to me, of course. A whole complicated network. We've got the postal system, going down the drain. Because we have this kind of individual and diverse need in all these arenas, the school buses, and yet still parents driving their kids to school. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then, I'm pandering to Richard a little bit here, but I was born in the Netherlands, and I go back frequently to visit my cousins. And usually I stay in Amsterdam for a time, and they had just finished a serious renovation to the major public museum in Amsterdam called the Rijksmuseum. It's where many Rembrandts hang, and it's a really wonderful building, built in the 1870s. And originally, they built that building, you can see here in this photograph, they built this building so that there was an avenue right through the middle of it. And from the sides of this avenue, you could enter the museum courtyards. They were 2 open courtyards. And over time, of course, initially in the 1870s, this was just a horse and buggy operation, fairly benign. They could just go through this passageway. Well, then, of course, the automobile came, and for a time, autos and buses utilized this passageway. After a time, they said, too intrusive. We're just going to leave it open to pedestrians and bicycles. So in the late, I would say around 2005, they decided they're going to renovate the museum. They're going to do a major modification to how one enters the building. And the architects, who were from Portugal, devised a scheme where basically this route through the building was going to be closed. There was a staggeringly phenomenal firestorm of public opinion about closing this passageway to bicyclists. And ultimately, the architects completely abandoned that idea. This is a photograph that I took. The bicyclists still bisect the museum. The entry process, is complicated in today's museums. It probably still suffers a little bit, but the building is no the worse for wear insofar as just the priority given to bicyclists in this particular city and nation, frankly.
As far as biking, maybe Copenhagen. It's just unbelievable, isn't it?
So the population of bikes, I worked there for a time. I remember my office was on a small canal, and every now and then we would observe a barge with a gigantic rake about the length of one of these desks coming down the small canal. The canals weren't very deep, and the rake would lift up its load every now and then and dump it on the flat portion of the barge, and most of that load was bicyclists or bicycles that had errantly sort of found their way into the canals. It was sort of a wonderful. Of course, we have cars and trucks. I wish they were all as cute as this, but this was another shot in Amsterdam. Actually, the train station is there on your left. You're just seeing the large canopy that covers trains when they come into town. But I love the diversity of transport in this particular image, in terms of buses, cars, pedestrian rights of ways, trains, boats. There's probably a plane in the sky there somewhere. Very efficient streetcar trolley system. So these are all, in my mind, sort of essential ingredients at some level, some scale, some appropriate scale, for whatever communities we might happen to live in. Another observation is, the land itself and how we use it. I showed you some images earlier of these very concentrated developments, both here and in other countries. Traditionally, we used to gather very closely together. I think In measure, maybe it was for protective reasons, perhaps. But I can't help but think that it was also a gradual reverence that we had for the land or the hinterland that surrounded us and its value to us, both for agricultural purposes. This is on the backside of Mount Mansfield, or for recreational purposes. Some nations, this is Norway, have an entire network, much like we do, the Appalachian Trail, of ways of which we can interact with the natural landscape in beneficial ways for ourselves. And it's interesting to see how that manifests itself. Occasionally they build some little observatories. This is over a fjord in Norway. This is a highly sophisticated bridge, pedestrian bridge that they built over a chasm in Switzerland, which they just dropped into place, prefabricated elsewhere, and dropped the bridge into place with a helicopter. And then, it probably seems like this is somewhat of a chaotic talk, but you're getting it sort of pell-mell from me. The other thing, and I mentioned this at the outset, is just really looking more carefully at some of the very simple and natural systems that we have about us. And sometimes it's easier to observe some of those things. We have been so homogenized in countries like this and the civilized West, so to speak, that we automatically transfer entire glazing systems from Germany to the west coast of the United States, or air conditioning units from Tokyo to Maine, without any thought or regard for the cost of transport, self-sustaining kinds of industries that support the people that live and work in a particular area. But we used to do this much differently. This is a Moroccan, it's been abandoned now, and it's interesting to see just the use of natural materials. I call this sort of this was a residence that has been abandoned. You can see the materials that they once emerged out of the ground, and now they're in the process of dissolving back into it. It's a sort of a fairly complete cycle. That's not to say that you don't want to maintain these places. It's really to say, look about you. What are some of the prevalent materials that you might be utilizing when you make a building? And what makes sense? How far does it come from? What's the embodied energy in its manufacture? Who's making it? And what kind of process are they utilizing to make it? And perhaps this is an exaggerated image, but I think to examine those issues for yourself as we go forward in the making of the places that we need to inhabit, I think that's a very rational and logical question to ask yourself. So, this is Mesa Verde in Colorado. You watch the use over time of the Indian settlement that lived mostly during the more benign weather periods up on the escarpment where they had agricultural fields. And yet in the winter, when they needed protection, they typically would pick places that were effective in their solar orientation and yet also provided sort of a shelter at their back, so to speak. Some of this was definitely also protection, so to speak, from rival tribes. And then how they used the ground and the constant temperature of the ground and the bulk of that masonry to condition the kind of climate that they were trying to create for themselves. And this is the polar opposite, much more nomadic kind of tribe. I mean, you would have always thought that, white reflects heat. And what is that scientific principle that I myself don't fully understand? And yet you see so many Bedouins and people in the Middle East wearing dark clothing. And someone explained it to me once that basically the heat that gathers on the outer surface is a kind of adjutant climatically. And the heat then rises with much greater volume than something that is white and reflective. And therefore, all these tents, these Bedouin tents, are all made of materials that basically keep the interiors cooler, surprisingly. It's another little settlement, historic settlement in Morocco. As I said, the inclination oftentimes, we do some residential work for people that come from other areas further south, and the first mandate is always, well, we want a house that is air conditioned. as opposed to, you can see there's a sort of a pattern here, a series of structures. They're all quite close together, and they all have 4 corner towers. These are all built out of masonry. Stucco primarily is the coating on the exterior. Very small external openings, on the perimeter. Almost all have a courtyard in the middle, and almost always that courtyard had water in it. Foliage, vegetation. They were trying to create a cool interior climate, and they were utilizing those towers really as natural ventilation shafts to get warm air in low and out through the top. Cool air in low and warm air exhausting naturally out through the top. So to sort of observe some of these climatic tools is, as opposed to something that requires electricity and a motor and all sorts of other things that I think are somewhat superfluous and vastly overrated and overused in much of our. It's the Maasai village in Tanzania. They tend to move these about a little bit more. These are all made of natural grasses that grow right in that particular climate. Everyone knows how to make a house for themselves. In fact, it's not a bad exercise for all of us, actually, to learn how to do that for ourselves. It makes us ultimately, even if you don't want to be a house builder, it makes us an educated consumer. And I'd advocate that course. This is a little more detailed than you might want. This is Pemba, Mozambique. I had a friend working there for a time. Again, available material, extensive roof overhangs to provide shade. Very little in the way of openings. These are very, very warm climates. This is the frame of one of these structures, just not large lumber components. These are available bamboo sticks that they weave together. Then they slowly infill that weave material with stone, small stone, with mortar. Mud, mostly, is really what you ought to call it. And then they stucco the surface if they can afford it. Extensive use of bamboo. And using it in more modern day activities as trusses, say, for example, where you can build a bamboo truss. It's very light. A couple of men can pick it up, and yet it has incredible strength. This isn't in the same place. This is in Bangladesh, but this is a small nursery school utilizing bamboo trusses on the upper portion of it. So this actually is a very interesting construction process. It's called rammed earth, where the earth, you have to get a particular kind of earth. They compact it slowly over time. It's usually done manually, but a very resilient and obviously, in certain places at least, an easy to access material. Should I hasten?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then we'll give these guys some time for questions.
You have the sort of modern, sorry?
Getting this, but Rolf, almost all of these are things you've been at or involved with, or?
Yes. Yeah.
Like, did you help design that nursery school that you just showed us?
No, but a friend of mine worked on it. Yeah. You have the sort of modern technical equivalent. This is the Arabic Studies Center in Paris, France, which almost uses a kind of kaleidoscopic sun filter. And actually that filter operates with the sun itself. So the sun gets more intense, there's a sensor that reads it, and those start to close and open. So it's very, probably way beyond me technically, but a simpler school. This is in Chad. They use some components from an airport hangar, and in a climate like this, the lower elements, which are classrooms, completely open to the out of doors all the way around. They don't sort of smack them one against the other. So there are always these easy to ventilate interstitial spaces between the bulk of those masonry classrooms. And then they used the steel basically as a kind of foil for the sun. So even up over the classroom itself, this actually never touches the top of this. So remarkable sort of ventilation system. It's a project I did maybe 40 years ago, which incorporated somewhat of the same. We basically, we're doing a large library competition, and we use the roof as a sunscreen, basically. If you could picture the webbing in a lawn chair, these were large metal panels that were going to be woven together And depending on orientation, they would open and close in order to let sun in or not, which was mostly the case. And then we used a water system that basically originated here, ran down through the sides of these buildings so that you had kind of this cooling agent at the base of those trusses that supported the roof. And you tried to utilize, we never actually built this, we just designed it. So a few buildings. I mean, Richard told me that there are some people in the class who are really interested specifically in this topic, and I'll talk a little bit about it. These are mostly our projects, but, and there are certainly some better projects, I would say. As I said at the outset, there's some really wonderful work being done in Vermont. But this was done about 20 years ago. This is one of the buildings. It's a classroom building at Vermont Law School called Oaks Hall. And this was really, at least this generation of buildings was one of those structures where we really made some dramatic adjustments insofar as how we were going to build this building. This was really a building where we tested the parka, so to speak. The exterior walls and roof are much thicker and much more efficiently insulated than is customarily the case. It's a building, you know, by UVM standards, it's not vast. It's about 32,000 square feet. I'd say Lafayette is probably bigger than that. Not by that much, though, I dare say. It runs on one residential boiler, the entire building. Not did we just insulate the building really efficiently, we also did what was becoming customary at that time for residential, smaller scale buildings. We basically blower door tested and air tested, infrared scanned the building to see where the building was leaking air. So we pumped heat into the building, and then through the blower door test and through the infrared scanning, we could start to determine where there were natural leaks occurring, cracks in the wall. This was before we put the clapboard on, say, for example. And we got the level of leakage down to a level that had been virtually unheard of until that time. This is still probably one of the most efficient buildings in the United States. It's a modest building. It's not one that gets a lot of press. It's also, in addition to the very simple boiler system that we utilized, it was the first time that we used fresh air ventilation, because obviously when you seal a building quite so tightly, you need to bring in fresh air. In the wintertime, you don't want to bring in fresh air that is cold. So you condition that fresh air with what's referred to as an enthalpic wheel. So the exhaust stale air that's going out, the heat is transferred to the incoming cool fresh air. This is a fairly common process now, and it's almost mandated for most of the residences that we build here. But it was really one of the first times that a larger scale Vermont institutional building started to work in this particular way. It was also the first public building in the state of Vermont. Some people are horrified by this, but the town of South Royalton, where it was positioned, had a very short supply of water. They had a very small reservoir. And so it was the first public building in the state of Vermont that used composting toilets. Most of these are environmental law students, so to educate them about some of these procedures we thought was effective. And it worked very, very well insofar as really reducing water consumption. Most structures in the state of Vermont and elsewhere are permitted, say, for example, for a load of maybe 15 gallons of water per person per day. This building is permitted or utilizes 15 gallons of water per person per year. So it gives you some sense of the reduction of. This is that enthalpic wheel I was telling you about that basically does heat transfer for fresh air. That was a new building. When we utilized it, there was a historic structure on the campus that they also wanted to renovate. They wanted to apply the same principles. I mean, we were much more limited. It was a little more difficult to apply the same standards to this structure, but again, we used the same system of ventilation. We used the same composting toilets, same approach to the envelope. and mechanical systems. So the prior building was pre-LEED, which you guys are probably familiar with, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. This building is certified as a gold building, and this was done, maybe 17 years ago now. So. This building also completely furnished itself with Vermont-made furniture by Vermont local craftsmen and wood that was sourced in Vermont. Hand-woven rugs by Vermont hand weavers. Really tried to use local industries and nourish them, and both were beautifully done. This is also a building that approaches net zero, which is very difficult because it has an incredible hangar for private airplanes out at the Burlington International Airport. It's called Heritage Flight. Extensive use of a green roof, wind and PV arrays, generates most of its own power. You can be artistic with the roof sometimes. We have a wonderful landscape architect who enjoys doing this sort of thing. I showed you Frank Lloyd Wright's house, which is about the same size as this house, recently completed in 2014. Here we utilized some interesting systems. Here we went to a white roof in order to reduce heat load. The Bedouins never explained that system to us sufficiently so that we could utilize it here. This is a PV array on the roof. But this portion of the roof and this part, especially when you go close to Lake Champlain, there's so much water runoff, and you've probably all heard about some of the issues we're having with the lake. So in this particular case, we created a rain garden on the garage and drain all of the rooftop water to that garden to filter it. And ultimately, we have several holding tanks out on the back. So that was an interesting project. Very extravagant house in some ways, but at least it's very close to energy neutral. That doesn't count the commuting that's required. Pushing the wrong button. Okay, I'm almost done. South Farm, this is a small community in Heinsberg. These are all net zero houses, basically. They produce as much energy as they utilize, mostly with PV arrays, domestic hot water collection systems, and double wall construction on most of the envelopes. Source of information. I told you that there are several really fine architects, and mine's more technical than mine. One of them is a guy you might have heard of. His name is Bill McClay. We went to the same school, but somehow I didn't learn some of the same things that he managed to. And he's just written a new book called The New Net Zero. It's an expensive book, but I'd venture to say that it's probably going to be one of the little Bibles that really points a pathway to how our buildings basically are self-sustaining. It's a terrific book. He did a great building at the Putney School down in Putney, Vermont. Two other books that are what you'd call oldsters, but I would say really influenced me in the early stages of my career. One is a great book called Design with Climate by Victor Olga. He really talks a lot about natural systems, orientation, just some of the basic principles that go into making good buildings. And then you've probably heard of this one, a landscape architect named Ian McHarg, who really put us onto the impacts that are somewhat wasteful and irresponsible use of the landscape, what kinds of things that manifests. So if you're interested, could be a good Christmas present, that Net Zero book. It's pretty expensive, and I get no royalties whatsoever. So that's sort of it. I hope that wasn't a little too peculiar, but yeah.